Welcome to The Pulse with Lauren Bango, a DLL podcast series. This is your place for tips, trends, and insights into the world of healthcare finance. Now, here's Lauren.
Welcome back. Okay, today we are joined by Pat Hanley and Tom Rickards, some of my favorite people in our asset management team. Before we jump in, and we're going to talk a little bit about FMV leases, but before we jump in, why don't we talk a little bit about who you guys are, other than my favorite people, of course. Pat, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, Lauren, you are much too kind. My name is Pat Hanley. I have been here for 33 years, all of which that time has been spent in asset management, doing various equipment types over the years. But the last 20 years or so, I have predominantly been focused in our healthcare business segment, which, I'd like to think I've learned a lot about the industry over those years.
And you're amazing. You absolutely have. And Tom?
Well, Lauren, thank you for having me. And Pat is actually right. She has taught me many things, believe it or not. So I definitely owe her a thank you as well. But my name is Tom Rickards. I have been here for 14 years in the equipment finance game. I have spent the last 6 years in the healthcare business, and before that, I was in asset sales for our tech business and our financial institutions portfolio.
Amazing.
Dealing with all sorts of different asset types.
All sorts of fun stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're going to dig into trends within the FMV or fair market value leases. But first, maybe we can talk a little bit about what an FMV lease is. So Tom, I'm going to kick this to you first.
Sure, no problem. And I think, Lauren, I think it'd probably be helpful for our listeners to have maybe a definition or something that'll give us a little context. So the American Society of Appraisers defines FMV as an opinion expressed in terms of money at which property would exchange hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller, neither being under compulsion to buy or sell, and both having reasonable knowledge of relevant facts as of a specific date. So when we're talking about leasing, typically that specific date is at the end of a lease term when a customer is considering if they prefer to own the leased equipment or if they prefer to return it to swap it out for something more desirable. And FMV is typically referred to as an operating lease when you hear people talking about different leases versus a dollar out or a loan lease structure, which is typically referred to as a capital lease. So today we will be highlighting some of the advantages of FMV leases.
So said differently, is that a lease where maybe the customer doesn't know if they want to own it at the beginning?
That is exactly it.
Exactly. Yeah. So a fair market value lease is a type of structure where we as the finance company retain ownership of the equipment, allowing the customer then to defer that ownership decision until the end of term. So it's a way to give the customer a little bit more flexibility. And then at the end of term, there is that flexibility where the lessee is not obligated to purchase the equipment at the end of the lease term, but they certainly may do so if they wish to do that. But there is also then the option to either continue leasing on a monthly basis. They can complete the outright purchase, like we said, if they'd like to do that. And in some cases, they can even finance or refinance that purchase amount into another lease if they would like to do that. And we sort of look at it as the fair market value is also typically the lowest monthly payment if a customer is concerned about payments. Because we're taking a residual on that asset, it just tends to give the customer the lowest monthly payment if that's what they're looking for.
That's really, really helpful. So what if a customer wants to have a fair market value lease? They're interested in that. They're interested in the monthly payment, maybe deferring the ownership decision, but they're really concerned about what that potential payment could be at the end of the lease.
So I think it might help just to talk about what the end of lease looks like, right? So what happens at the end of lease? So the end of the lease term to us, that typically begins, the process begins when the customer reaches out to discuss what their options are. They typically provide notice, and that notice is to either cancel and return the equipment. They can purchase the equipment at the current fair market value, or they can upgrade the equipment through the original vendor. So those are three typical options that a customer can make when they come to end of term. And the fair market value, since that is what we're talking about today, a lot of people question, well, how is that determined? And the fair market value is determined at the maturity of the contract, and is based upon the market value at that time. And, we know some customers may be concerned about what that potential buyout payment may be at the end of lease. Yeah. So there's something that we call a not to exceed, or a capped figure, that we're always willing to offer if it's something that we can do to ease the customer's mind. And it just gives the customer a little bit of assurance, that the fair market value will be either not higher than what they're expecting, or they can certainly budget for it if they do think that that's an option that they may want to entertain. And again, that's just an amount that we estimate at the beginning of the lease term, and we will estimate what that capped figure, we call it a cap or a not to exceed amount, will be.
Oh, how helpful. So that can provide them that reassurance if that's the piece of the fair market value lease that's concerning them.
Right. We do hear sometimes that that's something that some customers are apprehensive about. So we try to, add that in. We're always willing to add that just to give them that assurance. And then another thing that we can do is also provide financing for the purchase amount. If that's something that the customer is choosing, they don't necessarily have to pay cash for that purchased amount. We would always be willing to provide financing for that. They could do it to another fair market value lease if they wish, but we're always willing to be flexible at the end of term in terms of financing that.
How great is that? Now let's throw in a curveball here, and I'm pretty sure with both of your experience, you're going to be able to handle this no problem. But what if the customer wants to finance the buyout of the current fair market value lease and they want to add in some new equipment?
That's absolutely no problem. So in our industry, we typically refer to that as a trade up. So what would happen is we're absolutely willing to take that equipment that they have. Perhaps they want to add an additional ultrasound, or they want to add some other, another product to their suite of products that they have. We'd be more than willing to roll whatever balance is due into a new finance agreement, and we would add in whatever new asset that they're looking to finance at that time into another lease term.
Amazing. So, Tom, kicking this back to you, what types of customers would you say typically benefit from an FMV lease? It sounds like just about anybody could, but these are our vendor sales reps. Who should they think of when they're targeting who to suggest this to?
Sure. So I always think of customers who are always looking for the latest, most cutting edge technology for their equipment needs, and they pride themselves on always having the most up to date software or most up to date equipment available. And FMV leasing provides the ability for the customer to essentially upgrade their equipment at any point in time during the lease. So if 2-3 years down the line, something new comes out, like as Pat had mentioned, maybe a new type of ultrasound, there's different probes available, whatever it might be, those are customers that that I think would really benefit from fair market value leasing, because it does not lock you in to owning one product, a lease to own. You have the option and flexibility to upgrade it or return it and get something new.
For our sales team, just a quick plug, we can provide stream off reports letting them know as customers are getting towards the end of term, so that they can walk in and have those conversations, to talk about trade up and get them into the latest technology.
Absolutely, Lauren. We have a robust data suite.
I am so sorry. I completely interrupted you when you were talking through Tech Refresh.
No,
I'm good for that.
That was more or less it, Lauren. I was just going to say that another type of customer that I think would benefit from FMV leasing are customers who are kind of focused. I mean, we're all focused on the cost of things, but in particular, lower monthly payments. So as Pat had kind of mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, because in FMV, we take the residual, we hold the residual value. So essentially the note is lower, so the monthly payment is lower. That is definitely a desirable outcome for a lot of people who are focused on monthly expenses and budgets. Providing the lowest option compared to a dollar out or a loan structure, I think, is another great selling point for FMV.
That's awesome.
So yes, and
so helpful.
I will say one other potential thing, especially when we're talking about larger customers or corporations who, every salesperson knows how complex the internal approval processes can be around capital budgeting and expenses. And an FMV lease structure might have less internal restrictions and a more streamlined approval process, as it can potentially be viewed as an operating expense. And the leasing company, as we mentioned, will be the party who retains ownership and title to the asset during the term of the lease. So it tends to make things a little less complicated for the customer in acquiring equipment.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that we've talked about it on podcasts. We had Steve Sullivan on last week, and he mentioned, capital budget freezes are a thing right now.
Yes, they are. So
having a way around that is so helpful.
I agree.
So, what are some key things that our vendor sales reps should listen for when they're talking to their customers that would clue them into the fact that an FMV lease would be beneficial to them? Pat, maybe you can jump in.
Yep, exactly. And it really goes hand in hand with what Tom was just talking about. There's a few key elements that would really indicate that this customer might be an absolute perfect candidate for fair market value. The first being tech or technology, right? If a customer is looking for tech enhancement, if they mention that they have concerns about being locked into older technology, or they state that they always have the desire to have the most current technology, a fair market value lease structure is absolutely the most ideal structure for that customer. And it's also a great way, as we talked about, to keep the vendor locked into that customer, to offer them that trade-up opportunity when that new technology becomes available. I would say that the second thing to look out for is payment, right? As Tom said, monthly payment. Whenever we're looking at a fair market value lease, it's always going to be the lower payment as compared to a capital lease or a dollar out lease. And that might be something that's, the key factor in that decision-making process. So I would say payment is probably second on the list. And, lastly is probably just for a customer who's just unsure, right? They're unsure if they want to own this long term. Maybe they're unsure if this technology is right for them. Maybe they want to do a short-term lease for 24 months or so and test the technology and see if it's right for their facility, for their, for their office or for their hospital, whatever it might be. But that way they can, push off that ownership decision until they've had time to test the equipment and figure out if they're, happy with that technology. So I would say those three things are sort of key in just, keeping your ear open. And if you hear any of that, I think having an FMV solution is, sort of a great option for those customers.
So helpful. So I guess we'll pull it all together now and ask you guys, what trends have you seen, in recent years and probably more specifically in this past year of craziness that related to FMV leases?
Well, Lauren, craziness is one adjective that you can use.
Challenging
is another. Challenging. We'll stick with challenging for our audience today. So I would say that the current challenging economic environment has led a lot of customers to consider financing their equipment versus outright purchase options. Customers choosing the FMV option will, like we said, have the lower monthly payment obligation, and they're not responsible for the ownership of another long-term asset. I think that right there is key for the current financial environment. But as you said, crazy isn't just one thing. Crazy is a lot of things. And another thing that has been going on over the last 2 or 3 years and has eased to some degree in some markets are the global supply chain issues and the availability of certain components, especially in the medical and healthcare fields. Customers who finance with FMV have the option to keep their existing equipment. So no newer options are available. There's a limited supply of the new widget, whatever it might be. You have the ability to hold on to your current one until a new one is available. And that's one of the beauties of an FMV lease is when that is available, you're able to upgrade it into a new one, when it's actually available for usage.
Oh, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. So before we let you go, any last words of wisdom, any nuggets for the teams?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, we're here to help. Please get us involved early, get us involved frequently. We're absolutely here to help. And one other thing is the more information, the better. So when working with your salesperson, the more information we have about the asset means a more refined residual value, an aggressive residual value that we can take to get that payment as low as possible. So the more information, the better. Get us involved early, get us involved often. And also don't be concerned about FMV lease structure. I've heard over the years, some people kind of shudder when they hear FMV. And I think it's really because of the uncertainty about it. But, hopefully we have conveyed and tried to alleviate some of that there's really not so many uncertainties around FMV. It's a fairly common structure. It's something that we are here to promote and support, and we're happy to help in any way.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for being here. This has been so incredibly helpful. I hope that I haven't scared you off and that I can have you back.
No, thank you so much for including us. This has been wonderful.
Absolutely. I would love to join you again.
Thank you for listening to The Pulse with Lauren Bango, a DLL podcast series. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the participants. Nothing herein should be construed as legal, tax, accounting, or investment advice. Join us again for the next edition of The Pulse. And thanks again for listening.